Welcome to BIA Media, Canada's top black media provider. Whether you're looking for content on fashion, art, music, or simple lifestyle, we bring you the best the black community in Ottawa has to offer and so much more. And better yet, do you have a project you need help with? Well, look no further. We provide equipment, studio, and office space, as well as a team of dedicated individuals to help you bring those ideas to life. So don't wait. Check out our new website at biamedia.ca for more information on how to contact us and start creating today. BIA Media, your way.
All right, everyone. Good morning. Greetings. We are in the second week of our 4-week seminar on the history of Kanam Bournu. And just like last week, Daniel Roberts III will be, Professor Daniel Roberts III will be facilitating this course and this session. So I'll let him review what we talked about last week, then he'll get started. For those of you that are new, how our course works, there is a lecture for about 25 to 30 minutes. Then we break for a Q&A. Then we have another section of the lecture for another 20 to 25 minutes, and then we have open discussion. So sit back, make sure you have your notebooks, you're taking notes. This is information that you're going to get in this seminar. Chances are you're not going to get anywhere else. I don't know anywhere in Canada, let alone North America, where you will get an entire seminar on the history of Kanam Bournu. So make sure that you're mute, that you're paying attention, that you write down your questions. You can put your questions in the chat or save them for the Q&A. And yeah, let's really explore this beautiful history. So Daniel, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. I hope that you all are doing well. So I just want to start by doing a short recap of what we talked about last week. So last Saturday was an introduction to the course and an introduction to Kanam Bournu. And so we talked about its importance. We talked about its significance. We talked about geography to look at which part of the continent we're talking about. We looked at different sources. We looked at primary sources and where we can see what Africans wrote about Kanam Bournu, where we could see what Arabs wrote, and where we could see what Europeans wrote. And we also got into secondary sources. So we started talking about different archaeological sites that we can find in what used to be Kanam Bournu. We talked about some archaeologists who have done that pioneering research and where we can find those works at. And we showed some pictures of the archaeology to show what different African cities would have been looking like in their heyday. And we talked about the military, and we talked about the culture. So we talked about the language, we talked about the form of Arabic that they used, which is the first or the earliest form of an African version of Arabic that we see on the continent. We also talked about their military, talked about their cavalry, and we ended class right there to set up what we were going to be talking about today with Idris Aluma, who is, for all intents and purposes, the most famous, the most popular, and the most important figure in the history of this country. And so we're going to pick up starting right there. So we're going to watch a short video to start, just to break down the history of Kanam Bournu in very broad strokes. Last week we were talking about sources. Now we're actually going to be talking about history. So we're going to summarize about 1,000 years worth of history in this 8-minute video. And then I'm going to emphasize some of the more important historical episodes that occur within these 1,000 years. So I'm going to start by playing this video. I have it open right here. Can you all see my video, or can you all just see my PowerPoint?
When you have to stop sharing the PowerPoint and then share the window with the video, and make sure your sound is shared as well.
Right.
Hello there, my name is Dr. Katel. Welcome to Basic Nigerian History. Last episode, we spoke about the Songhai Empire. Very briefly, this episode, we're going to speak about the Kanem Empire, also known as the Kanem Bournu Empire, and you're going to know why as we proceed. Let's begin. Kanem or Kanem Bournu started when the Wagadu Empire was still quite young. It is the longest lasting empire in Africa and one of the longest lasting empires in the world. Around the year 300, the nomadic Kanembu, which is an ethnic group from Chad, were forced southwards due to political pressure. The language is where the Kanuri was derived from. So, this Kanembu came to the land that eventually became known as Kanem. The area already had walled city-states from the Sao culture, which had been around since the 6th century BC, just south of the Lake Chad, around modern-day Cameroon or Chad. In 700 CE, the Kanembu founded their capital, Kanem, under the first Mai. Mai means king or ruler. Their first Mai's name was Sef, or Saif, or Saif. Sef. Sef. Saif. Sef. Whatever. The capital of Kanem, Nijimi, is the word for south in the Kanembu language, which shows the fact that they were forced to move south. They consider that location south of where they used to be. The dynasty lasted roughly 1,000 years, maybe the longest recorded dynasty on record. Sef's son, Dugu, grew Nijimi in power and influence and began the Dugua dynasty. Under this dynasty, the Kanembu eventually dominated the Sao people, but only after adopting many of their customs and many of their ways. Kanem's wealth came from agriculture and its position on the trans-Saharan trade routes, which was linking Savannah and the southern forest zones with North Africa. It also developed a long-standing army to enforce its rule and to conquer other lands. In 872, it was mentioned as one of the three great empires in Bilad el-Sudan by Ahmed al-Yaqubi, who was a Muslim geographer and the first historian of world culture in the Abbasid Caliphate. The other two empires that were mentioned were the Ghana and the Gao empires. Around the 11th century, North African traders such as the Berbers and the Arabs brought Islam along with them and spread it through trade in Kanem.
Too many meetings? Missing the key action items? It's time to put
Cool. Yeah, I just wanted to give you some feedback that I've been noticing. One of them.
In 1085, a Muslim Kanembu noble called Humei removed Dugua king Selma from power and started a new dynasty called the Sefua dynasty. Suddenly, the Mai of Kanem was a Muslim like its western rivals Gao and Ghana. The Sefua dynasty lasted all the way till 1846, and it played an important role in spreading Islam, which was the reason why the Zagawa left Kanem and moved east. In the first half of the 12th century, the Mai king Dunama bin Humai made Hajj twice during his reign, and between 1221 and 1259, Mai Dunama Dabalemi brought the empire to its peak. Conquering surrounding tribes, gained territories around Lake Chad, north to South Libya, westwards to Kano, and eastwards to Hudai, which was in Cameroon. He also destroyed a traditionalist court which angered some people in his land and would eventually trigger a revolt from the Bulala and the Tubu people. During his reign, Kanembu students were able to travel abroad to study Islamic knowledge in Cairo, where he had already established hostels. In the 13th century, Kanem gained imperial status. It had become a major power, demanding taxes and tributes from its subjects. Its armies of nobles had extended into the territory called Bono. However, internal conflicts started happening. Political intrigue plus the subjects people rebelling after the destruction of their courts, like the Bulala and the Tubu people, forced the ruling class to abandon the city of Kanem, and they migrated southwards into Bono, the place that would eventually become northern Nigeria. Now that the ruling class had migrated all the way into Bono, the political authority now rested in Bono. And after leaving Kanem, the ruling class eventually overcame the attacks from neighboring Arabs and Berbers and Hausa people to found a new state in Bono where they could continue their internal fighting and their strife. They also brought Islam with them, and Islam became a religion of the ruling class in that area. In 1465, Mai Ali Dunanami began consolidating power in Borno after defeating most of his political rivals. And in 1470, Mai Ali Gaja started rising and stabilizing and expanding Borno, eventually able to defeat the Bulala and retake Nijimi, which was the original capital of Kanem. However, the ruling class chose to remain in Ngazagamu, which was the capital of Borno, rather than returning to Nijimi. The newly formed Kanem Borno Empire became even more wealthy and rich because of its perfect position. Ngazagamu was on the river Yobe, which was mineral rich to the west, agriculturally rich to the east, and it was also on the trans-Saharan trade routes. Things were going very well for the new Kanem Borno Empire. They experienced a period of drought that deeply affected the state, but it wasn't enough to cripple it. The Kanem Borno Empire in 1555 managed to establish contact with the Ottoman Turks. And in 1571, Idris Aluma, who was recorded as a great leader, brought the Borno Empire to its peak. Around the time that Idris Aluma was ruling, the Empire of Kanem Borno had enemies everywhere. The Turag and the Tubu to the north, the Bulala to the east, the Kororofa to the south, the Hausa lands to the west, and also within the Borno Empire itself, the non-Muslim population, such as the Sao and the Ingizim, were unintegrated into Borno. They all wanted to tear Borno apart, and Idris Aluma had to stop them all. In 1603, by the time of his death, he had already pacified the borders to the north and northwest, defeating the Tuareg and the Tubu. He couldn't defeat the Hausa lands, but he was able to secure the border to some extent by driving west into Kano. He also brought the non-Muslim population groups within Borno under control, and he defeated the Bulala people as well as bringing them under control. The only people he could not make progress against were Kororofa, which were the Junkum people to the south, and they remained a menacing threat. Idris Aluma had great military skills and tactics. He introduced legal and administrative reforms. He had built mosques and maintained good relationships with Tripoli, Egypt, and the Ottoman Empire. Kanem Borno was trading in all kinds of stuff around this time. They were trading in cotton, kola nuts, ivory, ostrich feathers, perfume, wax, hides, slaves. Idris Aluma had a lot of slaves from his wars, and they imported salt, horses, silks, glass, guns, muskets, and copper. We have a record that in 1638, a caravan from Borno was trading in Tripoli, and it traded 30 eunuchs, 100 young Negroes, 50 maidens, and a golden tortoise for 200 choice horses, 15 young European renegades, and several muskets and swords. Islam was also a very beneficial influence for the new Kanem Borno Empire. It helped strengthen Kanem's position, trade, and political relationships to the larger Islamic world. Kanem could call on other allies in the Islamic world in their times of need. Plus, the literacy and rituals involved in Islam required specific knowledge that made them feel very spiritually special and exclusive. Soon, Islam began spreading west through traveling scholars and learned traders, but it only really took root in urban centers. In conclusion, Kanem started off as an empire by themselves, but due to political infighting and invasion and all kinds of stuff, they had to overcome all this adversity, and they grew and became even bigger than they originally were. They grew into Kanem Borno. It was an empire which was heavily influenced by Islam, and it was successful and powerful and kept its people together through tough and difficult times, such as droughts, invasions, and civil wars. That's it for this episode about the Kanem Borno Empire. Next episode, we're going to be talking about the Hausa kingdoms, so stay tuned for that.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again. Okay, so it was mentioned in the video that there was two dynasties in Kanem Bornu. First one was founded by a man named Dugu, and the second one was the Sefua dynasty. To add a little bit of context to that, Kanem Bornu, as we've discussed last week, was an Islamic kingdom. And generally, what we see in Africa is that when a kingdom or a city is Islamic, their orientation is to start their genealogies, at least at the level of royalty, in the Middle East. And so the ruling class of Kanam Bournu, they started their ancestry with a Yemenite king named Saif ben Di Yazan. His first name Saif is where the second dynasty Saifua comes from, but he's a semi-mythical Yemenite king, so he probably was a real person, but a lot of the stories that are told about him are most likely not true. He's actually a very popular person in Arabic folklore, and so there's a lot of different stories about him. So we're not really sure which story is the closest to being the most accurate about his life. But in medieval Arabic literature, there are a few broad strokes in how his life is constructed. His stories are either set in Yemen or in the Nile Valley. The recurring theme is that he's going somewhere to search for a wife. And the main document that we know him from is called the Sirat Saif bin Di Yazin. And interestingly, even though this African country is claiming that he was their founding ancestor, one of the biggest things that D. Yazin was known for was going to war against Africans. And so in 570 AD, in Islamic culture, this is known as the year of the elephant, because this is the year when the Prophet Muhammad is said to have been born. The kingdom of Aksum was launching military campaigns up in Asia, and D Yazan is known for pushing them out and for making them slaves to the Arabs. And so he was a very anti-African person. I'm not quite sure how Africans came to see him as their ancestor when he was fighting against other Africans. Maybe that could make for some interesting conversation during the Q&A. But this claim to Yemenite ancestry is something that has been a part of Kanam Bornu's culture since at least the 1200s AD. Ibn Said, who was writing during the 13th century, said southeast of it is Njimi. That was the first capital city of Kanam Bornu. And he said, there resides the Sultan of Kanam, Muhammadi of the posterity of Saif Ibn Di Yazan. And what's interesting is that the commoners, who most of whom wouldn't even be practicing Islam, orient themselves in Africa, but it's the ruling class that orients themselves to Asia. And so this is something that has a lot of implications on a political level. And there was a Arab guy named Al Makrizi who actually provided a copy of a letter that one of the kings of Bornu wrote to the Sultan of Egypt during the 1300s. We don't have to read the whole letter, but I just want to hit this part right here. The Mai of Bornu was writing to Egypt because there was a tribe of Arabs that was launching jihads against his people. And so he was writing to Egypt to solicit military assistance. And the appeal that he makes to the Sultan of Egypt is the basis of Islamic Brotherhood. And in order to substantiate that claim, he traces his ancestry all the way back to Yemen to solidify the claim that he descends from Asians and not from Africans. And so to read this short part of the letter, it says, to proceed, we sent to you our ambassador, my cousin, whose name is Idris ibn Muhammad, because of the misfortune which we and our vassal kings have experienced. For the Arabs who are called Judham and others have snatched away some of our free people, women and children, infirm men, relations of ours and other Muslims. Some of these Arabs are polytheists and deviate from the true religion. They have raided the Muslims and done great slaughter among them because of a dispute which has occurred between us and our enemies. As a result of this dispute, they have killed our king, Amr the martyr, Ibn Idris, the son of our father Al-Hajj Idris, son of Al-Hajj Ibrahim. We are the sons of Saif ibn Diyazin, the father of our tribe, the Arab, the Qurayshite. Thus do we register our pedigree as handed down by our sheikhs. These Arabs have devastated all our country, the whole of Al Barnu up to this day. They have seized our free men and our relatives who are Muslims and sold them to the slave dealers of Egypt and Syria. Some they have kept for their own service. So I just decided to put this letter right here because I think this is very interesting in showing the political dynamics of religion. Um, but Diyazin started the first dynasty of Kanam Bournu insofar as oral traditions and the written record is concerned. But it's actually not from him that the first dynasty derives its name. It was actually derived from the second or third king of the dynasty, depending on which king's list you use. And his name is Duku in some translations or Dugu in others. He was the son of a king named Ibrahim, and he started what we know in history as the Dugua dynasty. Some Arab historians refer to the Dugua dynasty as the Zakhawa dynasty. So in the video that we watched, the host of the video referenced a people called the Zakhawa. Those are the people that he's talking about. But a few generations down the line, there was a new king to take the throne named Hume. He's also known as Ibn Abd al-Jali. And there isn't much we know about his reign, but the big thing to take away from his life is that he was the first king of Kanam Bournu to adopt Islam. So even though the kings claim that their ancestors came from the Middle East, it wasn't until many generations down the line that their ruling class actually became Muslim. A very interesting play of power and dynamics right there. But before we start getting into Idris Aluma, who is the most animated and colorful of our kings in Kanam Bournu, want to talk a little bit about their political structure. So as a Muslim country, most of the government and administrative structure of Kanam Bournu was based on Islamic principles. The Mai of Kanam Bournu actually governed his country based on Sharia law in the Quran. But even though the governmental structure was occupied primarily by Muslims, in characteristics and in structure, their government was very African. I'm not sure if anybody can see my video right now, but there's a book called Pre-Colonial Black Africa, written by a Senegalese scholar, Shekana Diop. This is a very important book. And what he argues essentially is that there are general features of monarchies that we see consistently in African empires, whether they adhere to the traditional spiritual traditions venerating the ancestors or whether they're Muslim. And in so many words, to summarize his book, he argues that everybody in an African society has access to power. So it's not just the elite, it's not just the nobles, but slaves, commoners, everybody has access to political power. And the king is always advised by a council made up of people from all social groups. And so we see that right here. So in terms of the royal family, we have the Mai or the king. We also have the Magira or the queen mother, who owns the largest number of fiefs or vassals or provinces in the state. We also have the Gumsu, who is the first wife of the Mai. So in African history, in countries that practice polygamy, we see that the king's first wife is usually his most important wife, and so she's known as the first wife, whereas any wife that was married after her is known as a concubine generally. But she was responsible for administration within the royal palace, which she carried out with the assistance of the other three wives of the Mai. And so, getting to what Job was talking about, see, here we have women who are involved in the affairs of state, whereas in Asia, we don't really see women involved with political power. The king was also advised by two councils. One was the Mai Kartawu, which in Kanuri means those who select the Mai. And this was composed of the Islamic and legal advisors. And they were led by the chief imam. An imam is Islamic holy man, essentially. The second council was the Mai Bayatiwu, which means those who install the Mai in Kanuri. They were responsible for performing the rituals that the king had to undergo before he took the throne. And the people in this council were predominantly Islamic. But what's interesting is that we can see those remnants of traditional African culture, and that the head of this group, the Zana Ngijama, recites the royal ancestry of the Mai to himself before he takes the throne. So similar to how we see the Jalis in the Senegambia and the Mali Empire reciting their oral histories, we see the same thing in Kanam Bournu. We also have the Kogunawa, which was defined as a body of the nobility who served as the executives and carried out the immense administrative work of the state. There were Muslims in here, but there were also a lot of non-Muslims in here. So people who were poor, people who were enslaved, we have a lot of them working as administrators, sorry, in the state. So this is just kind of some broad strokes before we start to get into some of the interesting history. So we will stop right here for our first Q&A session. And if anybody has any questions or comments, we can talk about those. But we will take our break right here.
All right, Daniel, thank you for that. And I'm going to actually take, so please raise your hand if you have a question, or you can put it in the chat. I'm going to actually start off, open it up, because I did have a question based off of what you presented. Could you go back to the slide with the two dynasties, the Safua and the yes. Is it possible that, because there is this discrepancy where you would think that based off of the tradition that the first dynasty would be called the Safua dynasty, but we see it's when that changeover to Islam happens at the beginning of the Safua dynasty, do you think that the history was rearranged so that that gives this new dynasty, this new family that's coming in the position of ruler, another level of legitimacy by saying that their ancestor or their supposed ancestor was actually the founder, even though the name clearly is not Safua. And they probably weren't Muslim. At least the majority of the rulers in the Dagua dynasty were not Muslim. It doesn't happen until later. So do you think that that is a historical revision on the part of the administrators, the historians in the new family that's replacing the old family, that they have created this ancestor or appropriated this Yemenite and applied him to the first dynasty?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I 100% believe that is the case. And let me see, where is it? In Herbert Palmer's book, The Bornu Sahara in Sudan, he actually talks about how a lot of titles for governors and for the ruling class in Kanam Bournu are very clearly reminiscent of similar names that were used in Nubia and other parts of the continent. So these people were African. Their ancestry was African and their government was African. So I do think that there had to be some sort of revision of the royal genealogies to validate or legitimize certain claims to political power.
All right, thank you for that. Robert, go ahead.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. The guy, why did the guy you mentioned who said that his people were descendants of Asians, were not descendants of Africans? Sorry, why did he say that? When was that again?
This was during the 1300s. I would need to find the precise date. I don't exactly remember that offhand, but the reason he did that was because there was a tribe of Arabs that was launching slave raids against Kanam Bournu. And in the Quran, slavery isn't abolished in and of itself, but the enslavement of other Muslims is condemned. And so what he was doing was tracing his genealogy back to the Middle East to say that we're not like all of these heathens around us, but we are actually Muslims, we're actually Asians, and so we are entitled to protection from slave raids just as much as any other part of the Islamic world.
The
Does
chat
that answer your
says,
question?
he said yes. You have another question in the chat about the king's anti-African attitudes.
Um, I think the only answer I could have for that is that we see that whenever an African kingdom has adopted Islam at the level of the nobility, that is something that is very consistent. If we read other documents like the Kano Chronicle and Hausaland, just even seeing the way that Africans who don't practice Islam are described as heathens, as pagans, as barbarians, that anti-African sentiments unfortunately kind of just come with the territory. Um, I'm not sure if there's a Quranic basis for that. I'm not sure if there's just some sort of internal conflict that needs to be dealt with, but that's just something that we see consistently wherever the monarchy has adopted Islam in Africa.
Just to add on to that, I think we should be careful with the language because it's not necessarily, they're not anti-African per se. They're more anti-African spirituality. I guess is probably the best way, because although they claim a Yemenite ancestry, they're still like, well, number one, no one at this time is really thinking about themselves as quote unquote African. That's not they're Kanuri, they're Gao, whatever that they are. So it's really the religious aspect of it that they're condemning, and it's not just with Islam, because one of the things that I noticed when you showed the letter that he sent, my mind immediately went to Alfonso from the Congo. It's the same type of letter, except his letter is coming from the position of Christian brotherhood as opposed to Islamic brotherhood, where Alfonso, about maybe 150 years, 100 and maybe almost 200 years later, is writing to the king in Portugal saying, hey, you have these traders that are in my kingdom and they're kidnapping my people. It's almost word for word, very similar. And I'm a Christian. I have, converted to Christianity, just like what you see in Kanam Bournu. We've destroyed the shrines. We've attacked African spirituality, and that should shield us in our kingdom from enslavement and that type of persecution, because we are not practicing those traditions anymore. So it's really interesting, as you pointed out. But I just wanted to say, you don't just see it with Islam, you also see it with African rulers that adopt Christianity at the same time as well, in around the same era. And a lot of that is traced to the economics of the time, because you can see the religion is playing such a big part in this, Because even the one slide, or it wasn't on your slides, but the one video that in the video that you showed, where the man said not only were they bringing enslaved Africans to Tripoli, but Cannon was also trading in European slaves coming the other direction. So it wasn't about race even at this time. It's more about religion. And those Europeans were probably the Christians or probably Christian Europeans that the Muslim Europeans had captured, the Turks had captured, and they are trading them into Africa. So it's really interesting how the religion and economics and power are all playing in, and then eventually culture plays a role as well. So very interesting points. Very, very interesting.
Can I ask a quick follow-up to that?
Quick follow-up.
So was his letter successful, Daniel? Did the people go, yeah, and support him?
We don't know. Al-Makrizi didn't provide a copy of any follow-up or response from the Sultan of Egypt, and outside of his book, we haven't found any evidence that the king ever responded back to him. So if there was any follow-up, we currently don't have any record of it.
Okay, thanks.
Because we have one in the chat. Would you be able to post the YouTube video that you played for us?
Yes, I can. I will do that right now.
Let people know about the website with the recordings and all that.
Oh, yes. So we do have a course website where all of these lectures are going to be put at, where additional readings about Kanam Bournu are going to be put at as well. So I will get a copy of the URL for that, and I will put that in the chat as well if you give me a hot second. Okay, it's gonna take me a second to find it, but I'll definitely put the link in the chat before the end of class.
It's in the chat, so you can continue.
Right. Well, we are going to talk about, where is it at? Okay, so now we are going to talk about the king of Kanam Bournu that we know the most about. So if I could just go ahead and find it. So last week we talked about all of these different cities that had brick ruins that belong to Kanam Bournu. There was a question last week about if UNESCO has done any efforts to preserve any of them. I have not been able to find anything about them being preserved. But one of the settlements that we talked about was a city called Gambaru. And we talked about how Idris Aluma's mother, Queen Aisha, built them. And so we looked at some different pictures of what the city looked like, what its ruins looked like. And I just want to refresh your memories with that because we're going to be talking about the city of Gambaru in a second. So according to Herbert Palmer, Idris Aluma is, quote, now perhaps the best known of all the Mais. And what he was known for was being a military general. So you could think of him as like a precursor to Shaka Zulu, or like a reincarnation of Sunni Ali. He was known for his wars of expansion and his wars for, as the video said, taking all of these countries that are rebelling against Kanam Bournu and bringing them back under his control. And so I just put a list of some of his military campaigns that he conducted. Not all of them are here because he just has so many of them. And as his Imam Ibn Fartua, who we looked at last week, said, where is it at? Oh, is the quote? Okay, yeah. So as his Ibn Fartua said, how is it possible to comprehend all his deeds, since in a single year he undertook so many expeditions? If the whole of the numerous community of the learned were to unite in order to recall them, they would be unable to do so. Even if they could enumerate all his expeditions without omission, they would not be able to distinguish for certain and without any doubt between those that came first and those that came after. So I just wanted to show this to set up how to set up his significance to the Kanuri people. But before we talk about Idris Uluma proper, it seems necessary and appropriate to talk about his mother. If anybody's familiar with ancient Egyptian history, there was a queen named Hatshepsut who was ruling on the throne as a regent until her nephew Tutmos got old enough to be able to rule the country for himself. We see a similar situation here with King Idris's mother Aisha. So his mother's name was Aisha Kili Inger Marama, which in the Kanuri language means Queen Aisha, owner of the white horse. Before she became the regent of Kanam Bournu, the Mai at the time was a man named Ali. Now, the royal traditions that we have written down don't really say a lot about his reign, but we know from contemporary traditions that Maya Ali was a threat to Prince Idris while he was still a really young boy. And so he had made some attempts on his life. And so at the capital city, Ngazargamu, Queen Aisha had to move Idris from there and move him to another settlement called Gambaru, where she built all of these buildings, where she built this palace, where she built a mosque at to keep him safe, because had he stayed in Ngazargamu, then he would have been killed as a boy. And so, just to quote Herbert Palmer right here, according to the present day tradition, Aisha Kili Inger Marama, the Magira had great difficulty in preserving Idris's life from his cousin, Maidunama Fana Ngu Marama, and the son of the latter, Mai Abdallah. But on the death of Mai Abdallah, she became regent and is said to have built the brick palace and mosque at Gambaru on the Komadugu. When Idris grew up, he became the Mai of Kanam Bournu, and he started launching all of these military campaigns to consolidate his power. So similar to what we see with Sunni Ali and the Songhai Empire, a lot of the countries that were vassals to Kanam Bournu has started to become rebellious, has started to build up defensive fortifications, build up their militaries to protect themselves. And so what Idris Uluma did was he made a concerted effort to humble all of these countries and bring them back under the influence of Kanam Bournu. So the first place that we're told that he made war against was the Sao culture. Now, the Sao are very important because they are one of, if not our earliest attested cultural horizons in what we now call Chad. And so I put this quote right here. It talks about how the Sao people were not a unified people, but rather they were a collection of federations or city states. And each one was ruled by a king who was believed to have a divine origin. They were artisans, they were craftsmen and metal workers, and they were also farmers. And they had started to build all of these huge, complex cities and settlements before it was even 700 AD. And so these are the first people that my Idris made war against. And we know from Ibn Fartwa that he built 2 war camps around the city of Damasak. He built one in the west and one in the north, and he built gates around them. And his purpose of doing this was to surround the city of Damasak, which was one of the Sao people's biggest settlements, and cut them off militarily so that they couldn't get reinforcements from outside people, and cut them off so that they couldn't defend themselves. And so what he did with the Sao, really interesting, he had a threefold military tactic for dealing with them specifically. So Ibn Fartwa tells us that in the summer, he would cut down all of their trees. In the fall and the autumn, he would destroy all of their crops. And then in the winter, he would wage war against them directly. And so the strategic significance of this is that with the trees, you have materials for making weaponry, you have places to hide in warfare, particularly guerrilla warfare. And trees are also important for food, getting fruits and stuff like that. And so he would strategically get rid of all of those, and then he would destroy their food sources directly. And he would launch these assaults year after year after year until the Sao people humbled themselves and made themselves subservient and took on a slave status for him. After that, one of his major military campaigns was in Kano City. So this was in Hausaland. And the Sao people are described by Ibn Fartwa as pagans. So they were not practicing Islam. But Kano was an Islamic country, just as Kanam Bournu was. So my Idris's motivations for making war against Kano wasn't based on religious lines, but it was more so on economic and political lines. To quote Dirk Lange, the wars against Kano had to do with the construction of walls around pre-existing unfortified towns. And so Ibn Fartwa's own words, when the people of the country of Kano wished to outwit, deceive, and betray the land of Bornu, they originated a new thing which had never existed in the time of their fathers and forefathers of old. Accordingly, they built in their country many fortifications. So in addition to building walls around settlements that were previously unprotected, they also made a practice of invading Kanam Bournu and then retreating it back into their settlements. And so they would take plunder, they would take people, they would take goods, they would take food. And then after they plundered Kanam Bournu, they would go back to their houses, they would go back to their cities, and they would hide there while the armies of Kanam Bournu would hunt them down. And they would stay hidden until the armies left and returned back to their country. And so Idris was seeing this, and he said, "Enough is enough." And so his response was to respond with, quote, "a shower of arrows which they discharged in great numbers." Additionally, Idris Uluma ordered that, quote, "all the musketeers to fire a volley upon them." And so we're going to talk about this in a second, but it's interesting that we see a reference to musketeers right here, because as Dr. Ledbetter mentioned during the Q&A, there were white slaves in Kanam Bournu as well. And so my Idris had adopted Turkish slaves in his army as well. And it was also from the Turkish people that he had been importing guns, importing muskets, which gave Kanam Bournu a huge military advantage over the people around. After this, another one of his major military expansions was against the Tuareg people. The Tuareg are a group of the Amazi, or Berbers as people now know them as. And my Idris led 3 expeditions against them before they became submissive to him. So his first expedition was against Siktala, his second one against Dankir, and his third one against Air. And Ibn Fartwa described the Tuaregs as ravagers who commit robbery and act treacherously towards the Muslims, committing havoc in the land and doing no good, and attacking them treacherously by day and night without slackening. And so my Idris's response was to command all those who were in the land from among the tribe of Khaliti and others to make raids into the lands of the Berbers at all times by day and night to make them depart from the land of Borno and go far away into the most distant deserts. And so there were a lot more military campaigns that Idris Saluma conducted, but I just wanted to highlight some of his most important ones. Some military tactics that he used, as we saw with the Sao people, he would strategically cut off cities and settlements from outside help. He also adopted a practice of incorporating outside technology into his military. Ibn Fartwa says, among the many things with which God Most High, by his favor, beneficence, generosity, and might, enable him to have, were the Turkish musketeers to present with him, and the great number of his slaves of foreign origin who were trained and skilled in the use of muskets. Another thing that we see, particularly in his wars against the Tuareg, was the use of naval forces. So usually when we think of navies, we usually think of ancient Greece or somewhere else in the Mediterranean, but Africans had navies too. And in West Africa, it was very common for the ancestors to have fleets of canoes and to make wars using rivers, most notably through the Niger River. And that's what Idris Aluma did. We know that this was a practice that had been going on since at least the 1200s, because Ibn Said makes a reference to the Sultan of Kanam using the riverways to wage war against non-Muslims. And we see the same thing during Idris's time, where Ibn Fartwa writes, there was also the instance of the large boats which he designed in his time for the benefit of the Muslims, so as to enable them to cross the rivers in the shortest time and with the greatest ease. And to draw attention to his relations with the Ottomans and with the Turkish people in particular, we have reference to correspondences that Idris Aluma actually made with the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. And so on at least two occasions, first in 1577 and again in 1579, Idris Aluma sent an ambassador named Al-Hajj to Istanbul to discuss terms of peace, diplomacy, and Islamic brotherhood. The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, his name isn't written in the letters, but he says, let him be informed and understand clearly. Be notified and know distinctly that your letter has arrived by the hand of your messenger, who returns to you with this agreeable answer. He who is the opener through his loyal friendship of the best of portals, Al-Hajj. May God decree his safety and facilitate his return in happiness. And so one of the big points that Idris Aluma wanted to convey with the Ottoman Empire was control of different geographical regions in Africa. And so in his letter, we see reference to a place called Kalat Quran. We don't know exactly where this is, but this was most likely somewhere in the Fezzan region around what we now call Libya. And this was a trans-Saharan trade route that would have had a lot of political and economic benefits to be under Idris Aluma's control. And so what he did was write to the Ottoman Sultan asking that he would withdraw his forces from there and leave the control of that place to Africans and not to Asians. Unfortunately, the Sultan did not comply with this request, and he says, if you have constantly been in the domain of our exalted munificence and stand on the foot of fidelity, then we will agree and set up a means for obtaining the requests mentioned, and according with what is expected, except from that for which your aforementioned messenger expressed a desire orally, the cessation of the fortress of Quran, one of the citadels of our well-guarded realm, in the course of his interview. For it has never been one of the customs of our noble fathers, nor the habits of our mighty ancestors, may God the omniscient monarch illuminate their proofs until the day of judgment, to cede such fortresses or other places as they possessed, or even a foot's breadth of their lands and estates. So, in other words, the Ottoman Sultan told my Idris that he was not going to leave this country alone, and there was nothing he could do about that. If there's any other correspondences between them, and there most likely were, we haven't found a record of them yet. But I think it's interesting because this goes to show how Africa was connected with the outside world. Africans weren't just sitting on their thumbs waiting for people to find them and civilize them, but Africans were actively being traders and diplomats and merchants and all of these amazing things. To close out today, just want to mention the fact that when Idris Aluma died, he was buried over by a river called Alu or Alo, and that's where his last name Aluma comes from. African oral traditions love to ascribe different aspects of people's lives to define how they're remembered. And that's what the oral traditions say about why he's called Idris Aluma, because he was buried by a river called Alu. But that concludes our presentation for today. Not tomorrow. Next week, we're going to be talking about the establishment of a new dynasty, one that was a lot more radically Islamic, one where we see a whole lot more scholarship, and we're actually going to talk about an African who was enslaved in a jihad and sold over to the Ottoman Empire, but then gradually made his way to the United States, where he would become a veteran in the United States Civil War. But that concludes our class for today. So we can open it back up to questions and comments and go from there.
Thank you. Well done as always. Please raise your hand, or you can put your question in the chat. Again, I'll start just before we go to David H. I think as we're focusing on this grand empire of Kanam Bournu, you can see, if you read in between the lines of history, that there's some other great stories that, if we had more information on, would be great to know as well. Those internal conflicts with people like the South, who are less hierarchical, that don't have the same system. Number one, they're not Islamic. Number two, although they probably had chiefs, and kings, it probably wasn't in the same way as the Mais in Kanam, and they were able to resist for a long period of time Kanam's superiority before they were overcome by Idris Aluma. But we only get the story from Aluma's perspective and the perspective of Aluma's imam, who wrote the history. We don't have the history of those folks. So if we had that, it might tell a different version. If we look at the history of the Balula, who were mentioned in the video, those folks that had resisted Islamization earlier and had left Kanam Bournu because they did not want to convert to Islam. They were probably a part, at least their rulers were probably a part of the ruling class that disagreed with the position to adopt Islam and therefore left the empire. So their history may also be one worth knowing about, because there was a confrontation. Those rulers that wanted to adopt Islam, to have this connection to the trans-Saharan trade and all of that. And part of that process was famously destroying an ancestral shrine that represented the ancient African traditions, spiritual traditions of the region. So that story is also worth studying. So sometimes when we look at these histories, it's important to go and think about it from that other perspective and kind of flip it on its head, so you can say, well, if we had this story in more detail, and what we can learn from this, or what we can kind of get from what's not said, how long these people resisted, the decisions that they made to not join Islam, to not be under those circumstances. So again, we're not just presenting this history as just look at Kanam Bournu, oh, it's so great, but also read in between the lines to see how an empire can have these internal contradictions, how some people can be for it, some people can be against it. And this is all a part of the African historical experience, and we learn from all of it. So again, yeah, thank you, Daniel, for bringing all those things up.
Yeah, and
We'll
before we go
go
ahead
ahead.
to David, I just wanted to add to that. I forgot to mention this in the presentation, but we can see those complexities of historical narratives even in Idris Aluma's wars against the Hausa people in Kano, because the Islamic ruling class in Kano actually wrote down a chronicle of their history too. And Idris Aluma and the wars that he made against them are not mentioned anywhere. The first reference to conflicts between Kanam Bournu and Kano land are said to have occurred 68 years before Idris Aluma would have even been born. So, it's interesting seeing how all of these complexities play out and how people selectively choose what to emphasize and how people tell things that are going to make themselves appear in a better light. But just wanted to throw that in there.